It's one of the most popular consumed products in the world, used in almost every single country and culture. And it's based on the world's first written down recipe. What I'm referring to is beer, the mysterious, wondrous drink invented almost 4,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, before they even understood how the process worked. And they thought that it was magic or gods that made this drink so special. Well, of course, much later, in 1857, Louis Pasteur discovered the properties of yeast, which of course was the real substance behind that magic. Beer is now made and loved and celebrated all over the world. And beer is indeed an intriguing concept, with lots of rich history behind it. And for the past 10 years, I've had the pleasure of experiencing that process in my home on a small scale level. And even if you're not an avid beer drinker, the process is still fascinating. So what is the fuss all about? Well, let's take a look at that magic that's happening behind the scenes. And some of you may even remember some of these concepts from chemistry class. So what's beer made of? Well, grains and water. So the first process that needs to occur is the mashing of the grains, where the grains are soaked in hot water to make those starches convert into sugars. Once this is done, the sparging process occurs, where that sugar is washed off of the grains and collected, while the grains are discarded and sometimes used as animal feed. The next process is the boiling process, and there's a few very important things that happens during it. The first is the hot break, where the proteins of that liquid start breaking apart. Also during the boiling process is the adding of the hops. Exactly when depends a little bit on what type of beer you're making, but it's the hop oil that's responsible for the flavor and the aroma of the beer. And the liquid that you now end up with is called wort. It's essentially beer prior to fermentation. The next thing that happens is the cold break. It's the rapid chilling of the wort to help those proteins in the wort stay separated. And at this point, you would move that liquid into a different vessel. And another very important process during beer making is sanitation and sterilization. Equipment is either sterilized during the boil or sanitized with chemicals such as iodine. And the reason this is done is because the wort is highly susceptible to contamination. But after this is done, it's time to add the yeast. So the wort needs to be chilled to under 100 degrees Fahrenheit before this happens. The reason for that is, well, you guessed it, yeast cannot survive in hot temperatures. And this is where that magic that we were talking about happens. The anaerobic activity starts where the yeast consumes that converted sugar and releases, right again, carbon dioxide and alcohol. So this is called fermentation. And this is basically turning it into an alcoholic substance. The next step that sometimes occurs and sometimes doesn't is filtering. It just depends on the style of beer you're making. So when you're making, for example, a Hefeweizen, you will not be filtering the beer. But if you're making something like Budweiser, you will be filtering the beer. And the reason for that is it further removes hop residue and sediments. So what do we have now? Well, we have beer, but where are the bubbles? Well, the next step is carbonation. So there are two ways to add carbonation to the liquid. Either naturally, by introducing fresh wort into the mix or fresh yeast to restart that process where the yeast consumes the sugars and releases carbon dioxide. But this time, this is done in an enclosed environment, so those bubbles stay inside, not like last time where they were just escaping. And the second way is through a tank. And this is done during either the bottling or canning process. And it's just forced into the liquid and then closed up. So, what do we have now? Beer. Without this process, beer as we know it wouldn't be possible. So from a very humble beginning to a very calculated current. Beer and the process is still as fascinating as it was 4,000 years ago. And did you know that even some of our founding fathers, Jefferson, Franklin, and Washington, all loved beer so much that they were brewers themselves? Well, so in conclusion, whether you love beer or not, the significance of its history and its current cult following cannot be denied. So beer is definitely here to stay. So now that you know how it all works, there's only one thing left to do. Kick back and enjoy a cold one.